Welcome to the Edifice Complex, the property design and development podcast. Let your hosts Adam Muggleton and Robert Bean keep you up with who is innovating and doing great work, perspective on the adjacent possible, and challenges to the status quo.
Welcome to the Edifice Complex. I'm Robert Bean, your co-host and unofficial mediator, here with my colleague, official agitator, friend, and you have most everything to do with buildings, Mr. Adam Muggleton. Say hello, Sir Yoda.
Hello. So, interesting one. I think we might have actually discovered a unicorn here. We're going to find out.
Yeah.
It's not every day you meet someone with the skill set and the job description that we're talking to today.
That's right. Today's guest is graduate of University of Nottingham in Architecture and Environmental Design and Henley College, where she studied English, art, psychology, French, biology, maths, and philosophy. By the way, that's a great combination. So many people get stuck in a particular area of study, but that's diversity, and I love that. She's been through the lead and brain world, and we're going to talk about that as well. Has been the director of Sustainable Development Solutions Limited, head of sustainability at ISG. But today, she's taken an education passion for the industry as manager of portfolio development and industry partnership at KOMPAS, which is an early stage venture capital firm with interests in the built environment, buildings, and manufacturing. And I guess with offices in Amsterdam, Berlin, Copenhagen, and Tel Aviv, which is kind of cool. Welcome to the show, Victoria Burrows.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
You're welcome. Victoria, two well-known voices in the industry, Bruce King and Chris Magwood, recently asked you to contribute your thoughts on their book, Build Beyond Zero. That's kind of cool. Tell us how you found your way over the path. There you go, a plug for the book. Awesome. One day we'll get Chris on the show and maybe Bruce. I don't know Bruce. Chris, I'm aware of, but anyways, tell us over the last 20 years how you found your voice being sought out after from legends in the industry, including Adam and I. Well, we're self-proclaimed legends. And how you find yourself in the world of venture capitalism. That's kind of a cool story. Tell us it.
Sure. How long do we have? I mean, you're quite right. There's been a lot of twists and turns, but buildings are what is absolutely at the heart of it. Sometimes people ask me about where my career started, and I start with my architecture and environmental design degree, but you're quite right. It actually started way before that. I took a hard left out of an all-girls grammar school environment in the UK and went to Henley College because they offered the International Baccalaureate, which is something that you can find at the time. You could find within sort of private colleges, and it meant kind of thousands in tuition. But something just didn't sit right with me, the way that the education system was educating young people. Very much a sort of league table, here's what questions you might encounter in this exam type thing, versus the International Baccalaureate, where you're quite right. You have, I think, 6 core subjects. You can pick which 6 of those you want to work on. You need to pick a science, you need to pick a language, and it totally helps broaden out not only your knowledge base, but also I feel the way that you learn, the way that you absorb information, your approach to knowing things by heart, for example, and maybe not the sort of more spoon-fed direction I was in before that. So, if you turned up to your English class and hadn't read that chapter of the book that we're going to be discussing, it'll be quite obvious, right? So it was all about preparation. It was all about using your brain, exercising that organ, and, figuring out who you were as a person, really quite young. That's sort of, you do that in your, I think, between 16 and 18. And then of all the subjects that you picked, I didn't do any of those at university. I combined some of them into architecture, because I distinctly remember, as part of the art module of the International Baccalaureate, I had sketchbooks full of sketches of buildings. I loved buildings. My dad worked in construction. He was in project management, and I would find myself in summers on his on the construction sites, although I'm sure that's not allowed these days. And I was just fascinated by the idea that, the drawings all over the wall were being built in front of us. And I went into architecture. My dad, working in project management, you might appreciate this, Adam, asked me to please not be an architect. I thought you might like that. And so the degree I found had this environmental design module, and it was literally an hour a week, but it absolutely grabbed my attention. It was, how do you incorporate passive design into your buildings? How do you capture rainwater and reuse it in buildings? It was that one part that really grabbed my attention, so much so that, again, my sketchbooks, my art, my studio work was full of sketches of these processes within buildings, more so than perhaps what the tutors were looking for. And that led me to take an internship at the building research establishment. I distinctly remember my tutor saying, just go and learn this stuff and come back and do what you need to do to pass your degree, because at this rate, you get your architecture degree, because I was so focused on the environmental design part. And I know that these days, even in that short space of time, architecture degrees incorporate a lot more as an embedded component sustainability than perhaps it was back then, which is really brilliant to see. So buildings right from the very, very start. And in fact, even earlier, if you like, I am sitting here in the French countryside, KOMPAS' French office, and I have bought a handful of properties in a little hamlet on a hill that we're renovating. That's been in my DNA since I was born. There's photos of me when I was 3 helping my dad out, on construction sites, on our home renovations. And so it's literally in my blood to be in this sector.
Well, at 3 years of age, we were probably running the project.
Right?
They would, I want it this way.
I've got this great photo of me in a dress. It's a beautiful dress, like holding the handle of a full wheelbarrow. Like, let me show you how it's done.
That's awesome.
I love that. So, a couple of things. One, congrats on doing the IB, because I know that's not easy. That is tip of the hat there.
Yeah.
And 2, it's interesting, right? Because you didn't fall into the trap of the sunk cost fallacy. You do this 3-year architectural degree, and you go, you know what? I think that was a nice time, but I'm moving on. Yeah. Very few people can do that. So again, congrats on that, because that enables you to pivot. That is a great life skill that very few people have, particularly professionals. Some people do a law degree or an architectural degree or an engineering degree. They hate it, and then they hate their career for the next 40 years, but they will not step away from it, right? So congratulations on avoiding that trap. Well done.
Thank you.
So I want to talk to you about being a VC, but let's talk about sort of your steps post-university. Because, in our business, and when I say in our business, like property development, there's a lot of accidental careers. You wind up tripping into things, right, that you didn't think you would trip into. So how did you wind up at the World Green Building Council and then at KOMPAS?
Yes. I think maybe World Green Building Council was more of a logical step than perhaps where I am now. I think if you'd asked me a year ago, I would definitely not have said venture capital. But my time straight outside of university, I went immediately to work into green building consulting, and I met, I started to work with David Strong, who's actually one of the very first people at the building research establishment who set up BREEAM, and he was sort of my mentor all the way through up to university. I've got another book here that I co-wrote with him, actually. And that took me straight into consulting. And I remember at a really early stage, even from when I was at the building research establishment, delivering training to assessors and doing the quality assurance checks on certifications. It was very tick boxy as an exercise. And I remember, like, straight out of university, straight into the real world, being like, the difference between an assessor and the way that this system is set up is reviewing a building design and ticking the boxes it complies with. And the minute somebody says, how do I get this credit? You become a consultant. And it's an entirely different dynamic for working on these projects. You need more skills. The building research establishment does not train you to be a consultant. It trains you to be an assessor. And so I very quickly noticed this, and we built a business model around that at Inbuilt Consulting, my first job, which is about value adds to clients, not just in terms of how do you maximize your score, but how do you maximize your buildings. And I remember that we used to try and have BREEAM meetings where we would challenge the BREEAM assessors or the BREEAM consultants not to use the name of the credit, and just tell people why you should specify low VOC paints, not because it's going to get you a point, but like, here's why it benefits the people in the building. And on the flip side, the finance officer would hate us because we thought that if we'd done our work really well, the client wouldn't need us again, which is entirely not how consulting works. So if we were able to kind of change the foundation of the way that clients would build their building and rewrite their playbook for, how to deliver a BREEAM excellent, let's say, as a standard, as a baseline. And it was really that value-adding consultancy that's led me to some of these publications and to be involved in projects all over the world. I was really fortunate to work in Asia. That's where I met my husband, but that's a story for another podcast. That was a good move. But again, like, being brave enough, I think, to say, hey, do you want to come and do what you've done in the UK for clients in Asia? I was, well, why not? Sure, let's give that a go for a while. And it took me to some amazing places, some fantastic projects. And I ended up on construction sites for ISG. So ISG were looking for a head of sustainability for their data center projects within Europe. This particular client wasn't seeking certification, had an internal checklist for sustainable design for their projects. And I didn't care who the client was. It was highly confidential. I didn't care who it was. I wanted to work for them. And I went there and discovered a bit more about, what happens if you put impact and performance first. And that's when I was writing the book with David Strong, and I was reading about case studies all over the world, buildings that were achieving Living Building Challenge, really going for the highest levels of performance. And there I was on a construction site in the winter, building one building at a time. And so World Green Building Council had launched this program called Advancing Net Zero, which was all about trying to push the market towards not just buildings that are a bit more green or a bit less bad, but towards decarbonization, because COP21 had just happened. The Paris Agreement had just been announced, and the CEO at the time realized that green building councils and the green building movement needed to do more to push the sector to tackle more of its emissions. And so that's how I ended up at the World Green Building Council. I went from one building site to all the buildings in all the world. Quite a jump there. Spent 6.5 incredible years working with green building councils all over the world who would say that net zero wasn't possible or feasible in their markets. They were comfortable chipping away at the energy efficiency, and yet we're seeing reports from my IPCC saying that we need to push much, much further in terms of tackling emissions. You've got this constant noise and narrative of net zero, net positive, sufficiency, retrofit, new builds, bio-based materials. There's just so much. Health and well-being, water. There's just so much and so many layers and so much to tackle. And yet we haven't even got sufficient levels of energy efficiency in every building that's being built today, right? It's absolutely crazy. And the longer we deal with some of these basics, the more we're adding layers and layers to this problem. Every one of those green building councils might tell you there's a different priority for them in the built environment. And it was fascinating to work across that whole global ecosystem and try and get to the crux of what we could do to help push beyond something that was more aligned with decarbonization goals.
So what Green Building Council is really an exercise in soft power. It's like a NGO stroke Quango stroke influencer type thing, right?
Yeah. So you have green building councils at a national level. One of the biggest is the US, GBC. You've got Australia, Canada, South Africa, UK. There's green building councils all over the world, and they will have members from across the value chain within the built environment. So you'll have, individual consultants through to some of the big guys. They work with academia. They work with investors, they work across the full value chain. And then collectively, those green building councils are then members of the World Green Building Council. So it's a members of members, if you like, model. And
one ring to rule them all.
Well, indeed, sort of. The challenge with membership models is that everybody has to agree on some level. And when you're coming at it from those very different viewpoints, there are some green building councils that are really pushing for what industry needs, and they work very collaboratively with their members to be like, we're performing here. Science says we need to be here. How do we close that gap? And then there are other green building councils who are part-time staff who are just trying to make ends meet, And so the value of having a membership organization like that is about the collaboration, that the Green Building Council of Australia can produce a report on how to electrify existing buildings that aren't already electrified, of course. They would then offer that to the rest of the network, to their peers within the world and the industry, and say, you can take this report, put your logo on it. There's no need for you to start from scratch and redo all of this work. It's yours. We're, part of the same network and ecosystem after all. So it's incredibly collaborative in that sense. And the power behind an initiative like Advancing Net Zero is just getting more and more people calling for a similar thing, reaching for the stars and hoping that we get to 80% better, rather than the 10% that a green building rating system might recognize.
Yeah, people forget it's an aspirational thing, right, at the moment.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Always has been. Always has been, yeah. It's about challenging the dynamics of the sector, how the industry builds. We know how conservative it can be, how fragmented, how hard it is. When I was working for ISG, I tried to get paperless offices. That wasn't happening. So, there's some real basics, and then you try and have conversations about sufficiency and tech and AI, So I do feel like because there's so many challenges, the sector is just much more comfortable in doing what they know, sticking within their comfort zone. It's very hard to bring in new ideas and new concepts, and working together as a collective voice, you can move the needle a bit faster.
We've had Jerry Udelson on a couple of times, I think, haven't we?
Yeah.
I know, yeah. And yeah, he's a friend of the podcast, and I don't remember the exact number, but he threw out something like there's over 600 building programs around the world that he's aware of. That doesn't account for sort of the regional stuff that exists. I don't know what the real number is, but I do know that when you start to get into that many programs, and every program has their own lingo, their own language, then it's like watching clouds float by. Like there's nothing to grab onto. And so collaboration, I think that's a big word for so many programs. And how do you eliminate all of that? I call it paralysis through analysis. Like, what do you do if you're building a building and you have all of this in your face? Like, where do you even start?
Yeah, it's a great question. Let's see. So I'm a big champion of the local tools because they help to unpick some of the nuances linked to the local context of a development. So, for example, the way that rating tools usually work, it's a long time since I've been a consultant, but I think is that you get criteria against different points or credits. You get it allocated those points if you incorporate that measure into the building. And then different categories of considerations, let's call them, of different concepts, whether it be under energy or materials or water, get given a weighting in some rating tools. And that means that no matter how, if you've got like an energy section that's got like, I don't know, 50 items they want you to look at, and then a water section that's got like 5 items, if you've had, you've got 1 point per item, then it helps to weight out what on weight based on relative importance. And in somewhere like the Middle East, where water is more significant, then the water categories are scored more highly than, let's say, how water is treated within LEED or BREEAM, just by nature of what's sort of necessary locally. I do feel that when you put a common target, or as close to a common target as you can get across all of those tools, then you start to introduce a bit of commonality in the way that they are assessed. So, for example, an in-use carbon-based target, like an energy use intensity, but for carbon, or a carbon limit for embodied carbon. If we can introduce some common components or principles into each of these tools, then you'd still get the benefit of having a localized tool that activates local supply chains and speaks the right language and is at the right level of whatever the local market is, but in a way that has some common elements between them. Then that would mean that multinational organizations and investors and the finance community would be able to speak the same language, and the buildings would be comparable. That's a big challenge, right? You can have a building that's LEED Platinum in one, 6-star in another, outstanding in another.
You said the magic word
yeah.
investing. I want to come back to that because another friend of the pod, Dr. Stephen Fawkes, said unless you get money people involved, nothing's going anywhere.
The Edifice Complex will continue in just a moment.
Are you struggling with paperwork, spreadsheet overload, and project management? Then Blue Rhythm is the solution to help you. Streamline your commissioning and project management process. Go paperless, increase efficiency, and save money. Blue Rhythm is commissioning and project management software by practitioners for practitioners, adapting to your workflows and processes, and doing things your way. Blue Rhythm provides painless and fast onboarding by bringing your existing workflows, forms, checklists, and issues logs into Blue Rhythm for you. You can use their pre-built templates to customize your commissioning workflows. And Blue Rhythm can fully handle the transition from your current software platform. Blue Rhythm is secure, scalable, and reliable, backed by amazing support, and accessible 24/7 on any Windows, iOS, or Android device. Why are you still using paper and hard-to-control spreadsheets? Start your free Blue Rhythm account today at bluerhythm.com.
And now, back to the show.
Just on the World Green Building Council. So when I was at university, not the IB route, that only just made it route, we studied systems so we did a systems thinking as a core component of one of our cool, and it was great. It changed my life actually in terms of how you see things. Once you understand this, you see the world completely differently. And I'm coming to the conclusion, like, take the World Green Building Council, then the other, like, national green building councils, and there's 600 plus of them. There's too many codes, standards, guides, councils. It's just too many. So we're at the point where complexity is leading to fragility, leading to inaction. What is I'm a big fan of minimalism, and just like, just tell me what to do. Yeah. I don't want the labor pains. I want the baby, right? So, is the answer and a way to sort of normalize this across different geographies and climate zones, energy use, water use, and carbon use intensity targets, regionalize. And you just say, knock yourself out.
I
do
think
what you
so.
gotta do, just get that.
Yeah, I think so. I really do. I think that regulation needs to be based on those targets. I also really like what that means for procurement or project contracting, like in the US, where you have the integrated design process where all of the design team are all invested in those performance-based targets. That's how these buildings that we wrote about in our book came about, because you could only achieve those targets if everybody's working together to get to them. And you're not having like the contractor saying, well, actually, I found this brilliant, cheaper system from China. And it's like, well, that's just knocked all our performance targets out the water, right? So I do think that having those targets for projects that everybody can get behind, everybody is bought into, and ideally is linked to the contracts of the projects, because that's how it gets done, is a really powerful way of achieving some of these targets we're calling for. The problem is that doesn't exist still in most regulations, and it's the frustration around how slow the regulatory frameworks are to bring in regulations along those lines, and continuing to enable, frankly, bad buildings to be built that we know are going to have to be renovated in the future, and we know how hard renovation is. Governments are enabling that, right? They're seeing fuel energy poverty. They're seeing people suffer in the extreme heat and winter, in extreme heat in the summer and extreme cold in the winter. They're seeing these massive climate events happening, and yet we're still building we're still allowing that to happen. And so I think born from that frustration that you need industry-led initiatives, and where there's a gap, another initiative comes out. And there's been a lot of fantastic works from think tanks like Architecture 2030 to produce a zero code. They did that years ago. They called it zero code. It was a code that essentially could be picked up by any government. It's literally telling you, here's how you do it. And it's just painfully slow to get there. And that's why, in the absence of that regulatory framework requiring you to do it, industry puts their head together and comes up with, what does good look like? Like, where do we start? Because we can't just keep building the way that regulation allows us to.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, mate, go on, you go.
I did a back of the envelope calculation a few years ago, and I looked at, this is for North America, by the way. Statistically, most buildings in North America, and I'm gonna probably screw this number up, but are less than 20,000 square feet. Like 75% of the buildings in North America are less than 20,000 square feet. And of those buildings, many of them don't require professional designers on them. So when you get into the 5,000 square foot building or the 10,000 square foot building, like our building codes say, there's a certain size and complexity of building that requires professional engineers and architects, and anything else under that doesn't require it. So I wanted to calculate how many buildings over a 10-year period were built by people who had no certifications in energy, indoor environmental quality, whatever it was. Turns out, in my back of the envelope calculation, over 4 million buildings are in inventory where no professionals had any training in energy or indoor environmental quality.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's insane. That's one continent. And actually, I didn't even include Mexico. So that was just Canada and the United States.
So here's another one. Globally, because that's where, so I go from one country to globally. There are reports that are produced by the Global Alliance of Buildings and Construction with the IEA. Every year, they're called the Global Status Reports. One just came out in March. And you might have heard this statistic around, the amount of growth we're expecting in the built environment between now and 2060. It's supposed to be like a city, the size of...
It's ridiculous.
Yeah, it's insane. And there we could maybe come back to the arguments around sufficiency, but there is a need for continuing to grow. We can't stop completely. We can, of course, do better, but there is still always going to be a need to keep building. In 66% of where that development is expected to happen, there's no energy codes at all. So now take that 4 million.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's nuts.
It becomes a scary story, actually, is what happens, because these are what we're building into a global society is failure. And it's like the train has left and we can't stop it unless governments get together and say enough is enough. We have to stop it.
And this is why you have 600 different systems, because it's moving too slowly and industry is trying to take the situation into their own hands. And in the future, they will be obsolete because the regulations will catch up. And actually, it's happening quicker now, I think, than it ever has before. Built environment's been on the agenda at COP since we were involved in the Built Environment Day, Cities, Regions and Built Environment Day at COP26. That was the first time that buildings have been on the agenda since the one in 2015. And then it's been on the agenda since. So it's definitely up there in terms of getting attention. They have announced more initiatives that are government-led, which is the big difference between, another initiative as to one that's industry-led. Is the Buildings Breakthrough is something that is government-led by the governments of France and Morocco and being coordinated through the Global Alliance of Buildings and Construction. That is bringing more political buy-in from governments across the world on the need to take action on the built environment than ever before. It's just 20 years later than it should have been. And now the idea is that there will be, these annual forums with governments specifically on built environment, not as part of a conversation on cities, which brings so many other, very necessary things to be addressed, specifically on the built environment and what that means for regulation. And I'm really encouraged by regulations that are really seeming to make a huge difference in countries like France and in Denmark, where there are embodied carbon limits being imposed on projects. So it's targets based and it's not prescriptive. It's not saying, you have to build in a certain way. It's enabling creativity and the collaboration with the design team, because you can't be on a project and not be on board with that target. You won't get paid.
That is the answer, in my view. You've got to let the market solve this problem.
Yeah, because one building built next to each other is not the same. And the challenge of retrofitting, going in and figuring out these existing buildings and retrofitting them, they're a complete minefield in terms of information and that's available and what needs to be done to these buildings to improve their performance. But we're baking that in, as you say, with new buildings, and it is a systemic change. But I do genuinely believe that giving the industry a few small, really sort of the target-based regulations, by giving them that target and then stepping it down in the same way that France has with embodied carbon, it gives you the long-term view that in the future you won't be able to build the same way you've been building. You might even have to, if you've got a carbon budget for your project, you might have to look at renovating an existing building instead of choosing to build new. It sort of pushes you down a lower carbon.
That's the future. Look what's going on with Marks and Spencer's in London, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, right.
And at the moment, it's just a few front-runner organizations that are taking the risk and the added costs involved by saying, we're going to do this. And it's reading the direction of industry, but you have companies like Bramble putting out statements about, why they want to be focusing on renovating existing buildings instead of building new. Those are engineers who make their money from new building design. And they want to be bold and come out and say, what, we want to focus on retrofit first.
So here's my investment thesis. I'm a chartered surveyor by background. Yeah. So if I had all the money in the world and I was in London, I'd go and buy all them horrible 80s and 90s skyscrapers and I would sit on them, because you're not going to be able to knock them down. You're not going to be able to rebuild them and then just retrofit them.
Yep.
Because you're never going to take away the banking guy's desire for that floor to ceiling glass on his corner office.
Yep.
So that's
I think
the investment theme.
The challenge there is that you need to strike this balance of timing between what is an effective regulatory tool in terms of enabling the right decisions. I wouldn't say forcing, but that's what I mean, because otherwise people are just going to build what they want. But also, the kind of reverse of that is if you push that too hard, too fast, then what we'll see is people divesting assets that they feel that they won't be able to renovate cost effectively. And then we'll have more stranded and empty buildings, which have massive potential if someone could come in, snap them up and do the work to make them grade A again and back on the market, because people like renovated buildings. They don't like tired, dated things.
But you're onto something there, right? So I read recently there's a building in St. Louis in the USA. So St. Louis used to be a big city, a gateway to the West, right? And it's basically lost its reason for being. It's like Detroit. It's going away. So there is this phenomenon in the USA of cities actually quietly being abandoned. There's recently a skyscraper office building there. It was sold 6 years ago for $230 million. It's just been sold for $3 million. That is not a typo. $3 million. Because it's just abandoned and useless. Yeah. And it probably costs more to knock it down. That phenomenon is going to rinse and repeat everywhere. But I want to move on to the money side to it. So, friend of the pod, Dr. Stephen Fawkes, he was right. It's all about the money. I'm paraphrasing there. He said it much more eloquently than that.
Yeah.
But, this is the problem. People need to understand, and I didn't get this until I worked as a development manager. So I had a similar job to your dad, it sounds like. One thing you learn when you do that job is architects are not your friends. Number two, you learn that, and this is my problem with the design community. I work for a design firm, so, I'm a crazy old man. This is how it goes. We're going to design a green building. It's going to be awesome. And they high-five each other. And they sign a little pledge at the start. This project's going to be awesome. Everyone signs it, puts it on the wall, right? Then they do this thing. And they put a set of documents out, pre-value engineering. And then they pat each other on the back and they high-five each other so hard, they break their wrists. And then they go to award ceremonies and they give each other awards. We did it. We did this. And then that thing goes to tender
Yeah.
and the value engineers get hold of it and the contractors get hold of it. And that thing is not what they put out and they are nowhere to be seen. And the reason they're nowhere to be seen is because they're actually powerless. I had a big Twitter nerd war with some guy who we had on the pod. You know, he's a professor of architecture and sustainability, and he's saying the architects have got to change this. I'm saying they have no power, none.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I used to be a development manager on British land jobs. Believe me, if the architect says something we didn't want to do, guess what? It did not get done. The money talks. So I want to use that as a segue into, you are now in the venture capital space. Now, when people say venture capital, they all think, you know, Sergey and Brin in their garage creating Google, everyone's going to be a billionaire. I can tell you, I'm an investor in a proprietary technology firm in the US. Proprietary tech in the construction industry is the surest way to make no money, right? It is like, you can't scale it. The whole industry is a Wild West nightmare. So how are you making money? How does that work? Enlighten me. I've got money. I want to invest.
Yes. What a nice problem to have. Okay, so I knew nothing about venture capital this time a year ago. And it is a brand new space for me. I joined KOMPAS about, 7 or 8 months ago. And it was because whilst we are at things like COP, New York Climate Week, countless events and webinars, and seeing momentum, however slow, starting to see movement from regulators and starting to see companies taking action and setting targets, big targets from the likes of Microsoft and Google about how they're going to treat their buildings, right? Because they've done the maths and they know that if they need to tackle buildings as part of their portfolio, then their carbon footprint. And those big announcements mean something in terms of making the cogs start to turn very slowly within industry. But naturally, people then start to say, great, okay, I get it. I know what I need to do. I know why. I know when I need to do it by. How do I do it?
Oh.
And that is, for me, what I was starting to feel while I was at World Green Building Council, is that as a consultant, as someone who's been involved at the project level, is that it's, we just need those solutions that help people choose the right way to do it, instead of using the excuse of, the perfect being the enemy of the good. Things are too expensive. I don't know what my choices are. Like, I don't know how much energy my building consumes. All of these things, and just going to events and hearing the same pattern of narrative repeating over and over again. People aren't sharing data with me. I don't know how to decarbonize my buildings. Where do I start? I'm just going to buy renewable energy. And of course, that's not what we want to be pushing. We want to be pushing reduction as well. So that is what led me to venture capital. I, to be completely honest, had no idea while I was working in that space, across all over these sort of global ecosystem, that there was this kind of pocket of industry busily working away with capital dedicated to finding the technologies that will help decarbonize the built environment. And so what I discovered is it was a little bit like Dragon's Den or Shark Tank. And, you have these funds who have this pocket of capital. They usually have a very specific thing that they're looking for in order to invest in. And sure, there are companies like KOMPAS who invest specifically in built environment. There's construction tech, Contech, there's property tech, prop tech, and other funds who invest in all different types of things like fashion. There's also different funds that specialize in investing in different stages of the maturity of that startup as it comes on. So we have a funnel, although it's more like a hopper because it's enormous, of startups that come through our deal flow through the investment team each year. And then we look at that to see whether it fits with our investment thesis. And if it doesn't fit with what we want to invest in, specifically things that decarbonize or help to improve energy efficiency or productivity or support business resilience in the built environment or manufacturing spaces, then it might be something that we pass on or pass it to one of our other funds that we're friends with. You know, we know what other funds are out there and what they invest in. If it's a tech that we think is a brilliant idea, but it's a bit too early or a bit too late to invest it for us to invest in, then we would pass that on to a different fund. So we invest in, I sort of see it as you've got finance, first of all, investment, such a wide sphere and lots of different actors in that space. And then you have private finance. And then you have venture capital, which is a specific part of private finance. And then you have VC funds who specialize specifically in early stage startups. And then people like us who specifically invest in early stage startups in a specific sector, in our case, the built environments, the very specialized funds. And then that feels very narrow, but then we know how broad and how multi-layered the problem of the built environment is. So that means that we get to invest in things that are right across the value chain. It's not just things that improve the performance of your building and the use of the building phase, the prop tech side, but it can also be all the way through to advanced materials or robots that will help improve construction techniques and efficiencies, all the way through to software as a solution, like and software platforms like LCA assessments or marketplaces online for different technologies. So it gives you a huge range of things that you can invest in, even with that very specialized fund. And that's what really excites me about it, because I feel that the industry needs to know that there's more solutions out there. We need to know what to invest in. And then we also need to make sure that that the industry knows that those solutions exist and that they can help them with some of the problems they face.
So many ways to go with this.
Yeah, right.
So here's my thesis, and I'd speak about this at conferences sometimes, much to people's disgust sometimes as well, right? So my theory is this: there's an S-curve in life. You know the S-curve principle, right?
Yeah.
Right. So the S-curve for green building certifications is flat and falling, in my opinion. And the Internet of Things, so it served a good purpose, actually. It set an intention. It took the market forward, right? But it's lacking credibility and integrity through the lack of verification. Again, it's like the whole design team awarding each other prizes for the great design.
Yeah.
So
actually, I do think, just to pick up on that point, something you said earlier about finance and investors. I think there is increasing focus on this, and I think there's some work happening. But it's driven by the sustainable finance conversation. So what you were saying about how money talks, it's because the investors are asking for more comparability and more transparency in the way that these things are assessed, that hopefully that will improve. But you're quite right. That's the
it's a problem. Dr. Stephen Fawkes, his quip was, and it was a good one: you got to be able to monetize energy efficiency. You got to monetize efficiency somehow. Then you're going to get money pouring in from pension funds. That's the holy grail, right? In a nutshell. But the thing with the space you're in and what you're trying to do, obviously smart buildings and IoT, them words must fall out of your mouth every month, right? Now, I think the cost to actually measure performance of systems and building in real time is, the technology is there and the cost is falling exponentially.
Yeah.
It doesn't get done because it's complicated and hard and there's no incentive to do it, right? I mean, if you've got a BMS system, you've got a smart building as far as I'm concerned, right?
Yeah.
But as that problem gets solved and visibility of performance goes from being opaque to being very visible, then you're going to find out who's delivering and who's not. Who's swimming with no swimming trunks on. You're going to find out, right? That tide's going out. Oh, you told me that was green. I don't think so, right? And then there's going to be lawsuits. And to quote one of my old bosses, sometimes there needs to be public execution just so everyone knows what's going on. Some big firm's going to get sued out of existence, and that's going to change the landscape. But the real problem is, the problem is not measurement. It's getting people to measure it and then take that data, make it public, and use it, right? And have you heard of
the CBD program, the compulsory buildings disclosure in Sydney, which is actually in the CBD, Central Business District? All buildings within the Central Business District have been required to mandatorily disclose their performance and use neighbours as the ratings You can see the average as a result of exactly what you're just saying.
Is it open source info?
Going up. Yeah.
They've stolen my idea, the buggers.
Sorry. But I think it's come to the UK, Neighbours UK, because it hits that mark, which is so needed. The difference is that in Sydney, it's a compulsory requirement. It's not yet in the UK, but it's got to be.
You need this name and shame thing, because then the Twitter mob come for you the same way they came for Marks and Spencer's in Oxford Street, right? Social pressure from grassroots is another driver. That gets politicians' attention, right?
Yeah.
I have a question for both of you. So is there sufficient return on the investment and enough social pressure that we will see, at least in our lifetime, the breaking down of culture that exists in the construction industry that just is so stubborn to change?
Yeah.
You think it will happen?
I believe so. Yeah, I believe so. I think it's. I was at a conference. I've got to be careful what I say here.
We like that.
Just before COVID,
more
on the edge
in LA, and it was an Architecture 2030 conference, all about. I think it was called Carbon Positive, and it was the industry leaders wanting to talk more about how we get to carbon positive. And there was a big conversation on the main stage, which involved a lot of engagement from the audience, a lot of heated engagement from the audience about the duty of care of architects to take on certain projects. If you look at a skyscraper in New York that's being taken down and rebuilt again, like the architects on that project, should they be doing that sort of work? Should we be allowing clients to specify that sort of work? Again, it comes down to policy and what you can get through, where planning laws exist. I think it's becoming, especially from within industry pressure, a sort of license to build, and eventually it'll be a license to operate. Can you justifiably get away with choosing to build this building? And is the building going to withstand the social pressures, not just of today, but what it will be when it gets built in 10, 15 years time? And I think that is as the awareness of industry is increasing and the gap of regulation isn't closing, then that stuff gets taken to the media.
That's interesting. Yeah, I think that's a definite possible future. The downside to that is it might distort the market. It's like rent control leads to high rents and no apartments for rent, right? It's just all like unintended consequences that might fall out of that are a problem.
I think it's got to be both. So let's imagine a world where if you are convinced that you have to build this building and there is no alternative for renovating an existing building, we put this in a report at World GBC about what sector-based offsets might look like, right? That you have to then also fund through compensating for the residual emissions from that project. Whatever's left after you've made everything as efficient as possible, you're still building, so there'll still be a residual amount. You should use that. You should compensate for those emissions by investing in buildings in the surrounding area to improve them and help pull people. Help to support things like, the social housing challenges that are so heavily affected by rent markets. And we cannot create this system where, on the one hand, in the commercial space, a green building is more positive and more attractive and attracts a green premium, and equally in housing, a green housing costs more to rent. Like, that just can't happen. You have to be able to have different models for the two different sides of that coin.
Aren't the Brits doing that with Section 106 deals in London?
Know that it's net. You don't know. I don't think you can choose which project. It kind of goes into a bucket, right? And then it can go to different projects.
Yeah, true.
But whether it specifically goes into, this is why we were sort of calling for making sure that it goes towards supporting the decarbonisation of the sector of the built environment. But that brings us to, it's about, again, the role of VC. And again, it's one form of being able to finance different types of development and startups and innovations. What I like about it is, yes, it's high risk, high reward. And yes, it's very linked to scalability. But in order for it to scale up, you have to solve a really big problem in a way that just makes it easier to do. And so, that might be renovation, like a company called EcoWorks that we have, or it might be reviewing an existing building to see its potential for renovation, but all the documents are in ring binders in a basement. Well, we have an AI documentation platform solution for that. So a green cement, people think that green cement is going to cost 2, 3, 5 times the cost of the market. Where if we've invested in something that when it comes into the market will not carry a premium against high carbon cement. So you don't have to make a choice based on cost. It has to be competitive. It has to be scalable. And it has to be something the industry needs.
So the industry needs to get away from this stick-built construction methods and prefabrication.
Yes.
And so here's an area like where, money has flowed into that sector and it continues to fail over and over and over again. Yeah. When does the breakthrough happen?
Yeah. I mean, I think, well, whether or not, I guess it's fortunately or fortunately, depending on what gets you excited, I think that's where AI can play a really powerful role, because we don't want to be using modular construction to just churn out Lego buildings, right, that all look the same. And so it needs to be something that is smart enough to adapt and have different kind of core components and then spit out different versions so that it doesn't feel like that, in the same way as, the way that whole communities get built in Australia. Something that kind of has a core component but is adaptable enough to keep it interesting and exciting visually and the way it performs. And, back to an earlier thought, I think the thing that could get people, young people especially, excited about what the future of the built environment is what is what that looks like. How tech and smart and AI and IoT can be incorporated into some of these offerings. To me, it's interesting because we know what these problems are within the built environment because we've been at it for a few years, right? And so in order to know what those problems are and know what the solutions are needed, you have to kind of go through the process of spending a few years in industry, right? And then and want to be in it in the first place, find out what those problems are, and then come up with a solution. Whereas we need, young people being just as excited about that. And we sort of talk to all sorts of young entrepreneurs, young founders who have come up with an idea, whether it be through their background in research or being within this sector already, that's like, hey, I can see a really simple solution to what seems like a really massive problem, and maybe I can get involved. And if they can find a way to incorporate AI into something that makes something even more efficient or safer, or frankly, things that are unsafe to do because they involve a lot of repetition, right? That's where robots come in and stuff. And I actually spoke to a founder recently at a buildings fair in Denmark, whose leading pitch was knowing who I was and where I was coming from, and therefore what was our what we were interested in investing in. But his lead of the pitch was, no one wants to be a bricklayer anymore. And we've come up with this solution because no one wants to be a bricklayer, not because of the carbon benefits or, performance benefits or, frankly, the feasibility of building this all over the world. It was pure. That was his leading line. And that's
good pitch, good hook. I like that.
Yeah. But it just gives you a sense of where we're at in the industry, right? We need people to build them. And if people don't want to build them, we need a technology solution for that. We're going to need the robots to do some things, not everything.
Yeah.
But equally, we need more electricians if we're going to electrify buildings, right? Like, I know that there's a massive skills gap there. More plumbers, we need the skills to deliver these buildings as much as we do to design them, as much as we need to change regulation. As I say, it's an incredibly complex challenge. And I really, truly believe that if we can, through venture capital, but not only venture capital, be identifying some of these solutions that make people choose better choices, then we can help get there a bit quicker.
I think your firm has a role here as well. So one of the reasons I started the podcast, my daughter Emily did a 4-year engineering degree, mechanical engineering. Super proud, right? At the end of that 4 years, her and her friends would rather flip burgers than come in a built environment.
Yeah.
And my question to them was, why? I was a bit offended, obviously. I think more than a ridiculous amount of money for this. And the answer was, we want to do sexy things. I want to work on the space program. I want to go to Mars. Their question to me was, who's the Elon Musk of the built environment? And I didn't have an answer to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've touched on it a little bit by mentioning, probably just in the course of this past hour, like 50 different problems with the built environment. There is no single solution.
Elon would say, I came along, NASA were there, not doing well. No one was doing well.
Yeah.
And then he did it, right? Now, whatever you think of him otherwise, he did it. So we need an Elon Musk moment in our business.
We do. I think I had this conversation with someone the other day. I feel like we need an army of Elon Musks, but at the same time, we definitely don't need an army of Elon Musks.
Oh my God, that is hilarious.
It won't be one person, is what I'm trying to say, that solves the built environment problem. There will be loads of them, and there needs to have the investment behind them. We can talk a bit about maybe those figures that we're looking at the moment. It's certainly not enough, but maybe not carbon copies of Elon Musk.
So let's talk about
the same idea, right? People that see the opportunity.
You need change agents.
You need an army of change agents. Yeah. And I think, especially at World Green Building Council, I was so lucky to be able to work with some of those change agents every day that can just give you an insight into what the industry needs. And that's what's led me to venture capital, even though that isn't my background, because that's the sort of insights from industry that we need to pull into the investment process. What does industry need? And what are the biggest problems that there can be a tech solution to help?
So let's talk about numbers. So your job is finding change agents and giving them money and setting them up, right? So you do Series A and B and C seed rounds, I guess?
We do, yes, seed and Series A. A little bit like, as I was saying earlier, a little bit like Shark's Tank and Dragon's Den. It's not just about giving the check, which is the first thing I learned about VC.
Yeah.
You can have lots of funds that have lots of capital, and you can make a great pitch as a founder, but just like in those conversations, in those rooms, sometimes you'll have several funds wanting to invest in the same founder, and the founder has to choose that fund as much as you choose the founder or the startup. And it is a lot about relationship, and it's we've touched upon scalability. Obviously, there needs to be an attractive return on investment from the initial investment, but it's a lot about whether you believe in the solution and you believe in the founder, and that they can build a team and scale up that solution to where it needs to get to. And just like in Dragon's Den or Shark Tank or a country you're in, sometimes those founders will say, actually, I pick you because of your network or your experience. And so it's not just the investment side, and we have a team that look at specifically that massive funnel of deal flow and review the financials behind it. But also it's a little bit about what else can that fund do to support you as a founder after they've invested. And we call that value creation, or in some parts of the world, it's known as a platform team. And so in addition to supporting that initial deal flow process with industry trends and, the technical due diligence around whether or not we think it's going to stack up, and bringing in the necessary experts to look at that, which is a really important part of evaluating a potential deal. Once we have them in our portfolio, and we have 17 companies, about to be 19, then they need a lot of support. And so ingrained in the way that they support them from HR, operations, marketing, they need to go from being just like the Jobs and Wozniak, from the garage to their mega HQs and global domination. They need a lot of support, and a lot of that is about timing. As we've touched on before, you could back a company and it just may not, for whatever reason, be the right timing. People have brilliant ideas that just don't stick because there isn't enough demand, and they were maybe a year too early, frustratingly so. some of the ways that we help portfolio companies is in advising them on what different policy trends mean for their solution. So I talked to them about what does the recent Europe Energy Performance of Buildings Directive recast changes from the European Commission. What does that mean in terms of demand for some of the products and solutions that we have in our portfolio? If a company is looking to expand outside of whatever country they're in, like where should they go next based on the regulatory drivers and the biggest industry need and demand for them? And then sometimes it might be finding companies that might have a use case for their solution and might like to run a pilot or a proof of concept or something and test it and help them with that growth. Because when we're investing in companies at the stage we do, they have a proven concept. That's usually the milestone for us to invest in. There's a criteria for what we call technology readiness level. And depending on the type of investment they're looking for in terms of capital, then we'll also usually be investing with other funds as co-investors. And so collectively, we can help them better. And we just figure out what sort of needs they have and how best to make sure that they can be the next Elon Musk in whatever it is.
What's the exit criteria?
Varies. It really varies. We're actually in our first fund, so we haven't had any exit just yet. But it will really depend on the technology, on the country that they're based in, whether they're looking for an acquisition or continuing to grow. One challenge that we know, and again, something really new into this journey, but there's a huge growth equity gap between having a company that was invested by people or funds that specialize in early stage investments like us in seed and Series A, and we can work to get them up to a certain point. But then usually there'll be other funds that specialize in Series B or C before acquisition or prior to an acquisition. And the funds that specialize in those areas are much smaller because, of course, or there's less of them because the capital need is so much greater. Mm-hmm. And there's massive billions of dollars, if not trillions, of growth equity gap between the companies that have been invested by funds like us up to Series A. So we back them because we think they've got a brilliant idea, and then they need the next layer, the next level of capital to step up again. There's a huge growth equity gap there.
So you might not exit at that point. You might just go along for the ride, right?
Yeah. It'll very much depend on the different use cases. We'll see as we grow with them.
Interesting. Well, look, we are coming up on time, actually. I can't believe how fast this has gone.
Yeah, that's gone by.
I could talk for ages about just the green building council because we could fix it. But we normally wrap up with a couple of quick fire questions from each of us, just one from each of us. So for me, seeing my daughter navigate, she started bioguns, she works for Raytheon and she designed spacesuits, right? So she gave the built environment a big no thank you. But what's interesting is seeing the world through her eyes, seeing her university career through her eyes, seeing her work, career progression through her eyes. And sometimes, particularly in a big firm like Raytheon, it's like, oh, the girl's here, sit in the corner, just be quiet. She hates that. She wants to be there because she's like, awesome. And to be fair, it doesn't happen often, but sometimes it does. How have you found that in the venture space in your career? Have you found being a woman is like still a bit of a problem, or does it hold you back in any way?
I have to say no. I haven't felt that in my career, and it might be, again, just going way back to my sort of educational roots and what my dad has instilled in us. And I always remember him telling us to bring him solutions, not problems. It's those sorts of learning that I've taken into my professional career that I think, frankly, gets you buy-in from even the most negative of attitudes towards sustainability. Because, as I say, I've been on construction sites. I've had to try and implement sustainability initiatives where people have been like, isn't that just like counting the number of bins or, doing a bit of corporate social responsibility. And And you really have to kind of overcome those barriers. At the same time as being a minority, being a woman in construction, you also have to convince them that what you're doing is valuable and useful. And I would feel that if I had, 20 ideas, I'd take the best 10 and really work them up, and then I'd only bring them the best 3 or 4. And by the time those ideas got to them, they were so compelling that they sort of started seeing the value in it. And then eventually, they would be coming to me with ideas, which was the best kind of...
You've just proven what I say to my daughter and other people, is that this business you are in is a social proof business. End. You can't just tag along, or you're going to be treated as a tag along, right?
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah. Go on.
I had I don't know if this is helpful for your daughter, but when I did a leadership training course when I was working in construction, and they had one of these like review things, test things that you do, like a questionnaire, and you answer a bunch of questions.
Myers-Briggs type thing.
A report.
Yeah,
exactly. And it spits out this report that like is written by a computer. There's like more scenarios than there, like, or combinations than there are people in the world. Yeah. And it's incredible what it spits out based on the way that you've answered these questions. And it's like it's written by the person who knows you more than you know yourself. You're like reading this thinking, oh my gosh, this is absolutely me. And then there's a section that says, ways to work with Victoria. And the first line says, do not tell Victoria it cannot be done.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's...
So I feel like solutions, not problems, is
I like that.
That's good.
Made its way into everything. And, even in my personal life, like I live on a hamlet in rural France, absolutely by choice, doing renovation and DIY on my own houses. It's not for everyone. It's my brother lived in Dubai for 6 years and has no idea why I choose to live like this. And I have no idea why he chooses to live in Dubai. So, you have to I would really just say that you need to figure out what makes you tick, grab that with both hands, and then build up that social capital that means you belong in that room.
That's a great statement. Victoria, I just came back from a long trip, 3 months, 5 countries, 8 airlines, 16 flights, and 30 different places that I stayed in. Oh. And it was in Southeast Asia and the Middle East. And part of our objective was to get into the villages and to see vernacular architecture and how people lived. And I'm listening to you and Adam talk, and I see this big, huge world, finance and governments and building programs, but I can't stop thinking about, I rented a motorcycle and I was in the Philippines on one of the small islands, and on my journey, noticing that every little hut had a little small solar collector on it. And I thought to myself, first, well, isn't this interesting that this community of people in this small island in the world is, taking steps to be sustainable? And then it dawned on me, the only reason why they have these small solar collectors is because they need a light to read by and a way to charge their phone. And then when I got into some of the bigger cities, particularly in Vietnam, and looking at how many millions of people live, between Indonesia and the Philippines and Vietnam, how many millions of people and how many gas-powered motorcycles exist. And then going back and looking at, how people are living and their lifestyle, everything, there's nothing to waste because they have nothing.
Yeah.
And this word, sufficiency. And I'm trying to make the connection here between what, the complexity, the finance, all of these programs, and yet these people in these villages that are just trying to make a living, trying to support their family, and just how big that problem is. And where does the worlds come together, and where you can solve actually solutions on both sides. The people that have very little in this world are sufficient because they have nothing. Nothing goes to waste.
Yep.
And yet we have so much waste on the other side. So we can learn a lot about that. How do we bring these worlds together and equate equity between them?
You're so right. And first of all, can we have a podcast about that trip, please? I want to hear.
Absolutely.
Yeah. That sounds absolutely fascinating.
It was fascinating.
And I think you're absolutely right. And it's that sort of putting into really stark contrast when you travel between them in such, short amount of time, right? I was going to use the word sufficiency as well, right? People in those situations live as they do because they have no other choice. They are working with what's available to them.
Mm-hmm.
And the flip side, in cities, and particularly now that we have the internet and we can search for stuff that we want versus what's available down the road, is convenience driven, and that has ultimately pushed up our emissions. It's super important that we go back to basics sometimes, like sometimes from design principles. We build in a lot of complexity into our designs because those systems exist, when actually it could be a lot more simple if we go back to some of even the most primitive vernacular styles of architecture. We really don't need a lot of the stuff that we put in our buildings, and I feel like we do it for convenience. And actually, on a sort of more kind of, I guess, philosophical level, the idea that I mentioned earlier about sector-based compensation, I know it's a big ask, and it's something that I again was told a lot that it couldn't be done because it's a very hard thing to try and solve. But what I was mentioning earlier about if you have a new development and you are offsetting your residual emissions with a development next door, there's no reason why that couldn't be supporting other communities parts of the world. And this idea actually came out from, I visited Hong Kong pre-COVID 2019. I visited Hong Kong and then was on a webinar in Cameroon like a week later. And in Hong Kong, they were saying, well, we can't, the renewable energy certificates that we could get would have to be from mainland China, and we don't know, where that's coming from. So we don't know if we want to go down the offsets route. And then in Cameroon, they're saying, well, we want to do this, but we don't have the finance to invest into these projects. And I was like, well, hey, how about we take those projects and those buildings who want to offset their emissions and use that capital to invest in projects in different parts of the world who desperately need it for some of the basics, frankly.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we need to address that balance, because it's that's what's gotten us into this mess, frankly. It's not so that we can support more growth to continue to be detrimental to our systems. It's so that we can invest in the right types of growth.
There's a business there, right?
There is.
To put those two people.
Absolutely.
I'll pitch you on that in 6 months' time.
Sure. Yeah, please.
Well, there is, because if you could create a global fund, and looking at developing nations that need help.
Yeah.
But in terms of reciprocity, it's almost like we want to help whatever community in the world, and we're willing to provide funding through the processes. But in that process, we need to adopt some of their processes in our building. So,
Yes.
you know what I mean? Yeah. And so going back to vernacular architecture. So I don't want to use Oman, but the architecture in traditional Omanian architecture is very conservative, very homogeneous. I mean, when you fly over Muscat, every building is white. No building is over 3 stories.
Yeah.
And, and it's very, very traditional. But if there was cultures like that, and Oman doesn't need the money, that's why I want to use the example, but they are trying to grow their country. I think the population, they have a huge target for population growth. But if I was an investor in a building and I wanted to do outreach and support, what can I take from their culture architecturally and adopt it to the building that I want to build, and in turn provide funding, to get that reciprocity going? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's a natural, as you mentioned a bit earlier, there's a natural sufficiency built into how you approach vernacular architecture, because it's usually based on the climate and the local conditions, and it's based on local materials. I've got my houses here in France. You can't see, unfortunately, because it's downstairs. But on my houses here in France, I've got big, thick sandstone walls, and I don't have air conditioning. I don't need air conditioning even when it gets to 40 degrees in the summer. And yet you don't build new buildings like that here in France. So even closer to home, we're not taking on some of those very immediate, very obvious, in-our-face benefits that we could be maximizing on. I do think that it's when we try to perhaps build with different measures, different techniques, maybe because they're cheaper. I'm not actually sure why you would build another way, actually, by choice. But maybe it's out of convenience. Again, it can happen faster, it can happen quicker. You don't have to, the manual labor in the same way. It's then when you start to then close that box up and try to air condition that box that you start to introduce active systems that start to make the building much, much more complex than perhaps it really needs to be. And some of the most exciting buildings that I've had the real privilege of visiting have really interrogated whether that is the case. Like, do you have to work within this dew point or within this temperature? That within this operating temperature all year round, or can you maybe expect that people might wear a jumper in the winter, and actually really interrogate that and what it therefore means for building systems. And I think you get rid of a lot of redundancy in systems by taking that approach instead of going with whatever it is that regulation requires.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be 21 degrees C plus or minus 1, does it? It's thing called...
No. And there's no standard in the world that says that you require that. It's crazy.
That's interesting.
Well, we could talk forever. I'm sure. Adam,
So listen, we better wrap it up now. But thank you so much for coming. Yeah. Very interesting conversation. I could talk to you all day.
Yeah.
So
likewise.
Wish you great success in what you're doing, because personally, in my view, it's the money that changes things. Money calls the shots, right? So money is probably the biggest change agent we have right now. I know people don't want to hear that, but that is the truth. So good luck, and thank you for coming on.
Yeah, thanks, Victoria.
Thank you both.
The Edifice Complex will continue in just a moment.
Are you passionate about the built environment? Do you want to learn from the industry's most inspiring, intelligent, and accomplished professionals? Then the companion to this podcast, Wisdom of the Property Crowd, is just the book for you. From Edifice Complex podcast interviews, this book distills the critical thinking, insight, and ideas of some of the property industry's most accomplished and respected practitioners. Each chapter is a synopsis of an hour-plus interview, capturing the takeaways and insights, including diagrams and images, to help explain concepts and ideas. There's also a brief bio about the interviewee and a QR code linked to the podcast episode for those that want to explore further. These are the mentors you wish you had in college. Wisdom of the Property Crowd by Adam Muggleton. Available on Amazon worldwide.
And now, back to the show.
Adam, like we said towards the end of the interview, like we could have talked to Victoria for like hours.
Yeah.
Because of her passion again. Like we love talking to passionate people. And as she said herself, she has a can-do attitude. She deals in solutions, not problems.
Yeah, I love that.
I love that too.
Yeah, she's. There were like 3 podcasts that I could have spoke to her about the World Crew Building Council, her career and what she's doing as a venture capitalist. I mean, she's quite young, but she's had such an interesting career so far.
Yeah, some of the things that really intrigued me. One, it had to do with her dad bringing her to the construction site when she was 3 years old.
He sounded like a gangster. Don't be an architect, please.
And then she rebelled against it. So there's a lesson right there, right? And that part of that thing is, being brave, because she said, be brave, which I thought was brilliant. One of the statements. I remember as a small boy, going on to construction sites with my dad. And I remember them vividly because of the smells, the smell of the concrete, the smell of the dirt, the smell of the form oil, the smell of cut wood. It was, and I just remember how that just, I don't know what it did to my DNA, but I knew that as a very young kid, that I wanted that in my life.
Yeah.
And it was just one of those moments. And so when she was talking about the story about her dad bringing to the job site at 3 years old, I get it. Like I totally got that. And the way she progressed,
Yeah.
and that field of study, the diverse field of study that she had, coming from the school, I guess it was a girls' school, and then going to study all of the different subjects that she studied. And as soon as I read that in her bio, that's awesome to have that kind of diversity. And we've seen that actually in many guests, haven't we?
Yeah.
Where their background, they've studied many things.
I don't know if you're aware, the International Baccalaureate is like the gold standard of high school education. It is like hard. It's academic. There's no concessions for you. Oh, you a bit dyslexic? No. Their answer is get over it, right? So it's really like a lot of people who think they're good go to the baccalaureate route and they fail. So you have to be academic to get through that. There's no ifs, ands about it.
Wow, so it's like
any university in the world with the IB. Right?
Wow.
So she's clearly academic, but she's also got that, she's that rare beast where she's got the academic chops, but she's also got the practical right thing. Because super academic people typically don't do well in our business, I find, because they haven't got that, what of a better word, street smarts.
Yep.
That ability to communicate and do all the other stuff.
Yeah.
So she's got that unusual thing. And to prepare you to go into VC in our business, working at the World Green Building Council must have been a great prep. Seeing how that whole sausage is made, right? Because it's like an organization of organizations.
Right.
Can you imagine the politics? What does a 10 glass of wine conversation look like at the World Green?
Oh my God. Sounds like a big hangover all the time, actually. That's what it is. The ability to pivot.
Yeah.
A skill set. And I think you brought that up, the ability to be down a path and realizing, it's time to move, to switch.
Hard.
Yeah.
It would be a bit like my daughter's doing that 4-year mechanical engineering degree and going, Dad, I don't think that's for me. I've just paid out all that money for it, Luckily, she didn't do that, so I didn't have to cry. But do you know what I mean?
Parents all over the world. Oh, yeah. Totally. Earlier on, she said something about not maximizing the score, but maximizing the building. I just about jumped for joy. Because, as a member of some different committees within ASHRAE, and we write standards, and there was a time actually within LEED, the compliance with some of the standards was a checkmark process. And then the members in our committee, we would that's not what this is about. This is not about checking the box. If you want to comply with the standard, then you actually have to do some work. And so I think there's a huge message in there about checking boxes versus what is this actually about?
This is the trap that LEED and all these green building councils have. They had to make it easy to do. So that's why they went down the checkbox route, right? Mm. But then it becomes a thing on itself, and it's hard to move past that because that's what people get used to, right? They're comfortable with that. Careers and businesses start around that.
Yeah.
And the next evolution is harder. And, so you're saying to people, guess what? You're going to work a bit harder, make a little bit less money, and it's going to be more difficult to do. Who's in? Said nobody.
You said something, and I didn't catch the last part of it, but it was really good. And that was that complexity leads to fragility.
Oh, absolutely.
And then you followed up with something else. I don't remember what that was.
So this is a system thinking thing, right? So everything's a system. There's systems within systems, right? And this is the thing with sustainability. It's about where you draw the boundary around the system, right? So there was a thing I responded to on LinkedIn yesterday. Someone's going, electric heating is 100% efficient. 1 kilowatt of power is 1 kilowatt of heat. Oh, really? What about the transmission losses?
Right.
What about the manufacturing of the electricity? So if you draw the boundary around the building, yes, everything should be electric. if you draw the boundary around the distribution system and then the production system of power,
Yeah.
you start getting a bit different. Then if you draw the
Absolutely.
boundary around the country and the world,
Yeah.
so systems, the key, and this is what we touched on at the end as well, right? I'm a big fan of passive solutions, like high performance facades, less mechanical.
Yeah,
I'm
absolutely.
the anti-variable air volume guy.
Yeah.
I'll give you 1,000 reasons why you shouldn't do a VAV system, because they're too complex and they never work properly. They never set up properly. So if you can get to like passive solutions, displacement vent, radiant heating and cooling, like, and keep it simple, you don't need 1,000 BAS points, right? Just a few.
Yeah, that's
There's
right.
nothing wrong with that, right? But we're all down this complexity path, and that leads to fragility.
Yeah.
Take the VAV system. Let's pretend there's a world where it's been designed properly, installed properly, and set up properly, right? This has never happened, by the way, ever. Then let's say the FM guy gets hold of it and he gets a complaint. He starts messing with all the multitude of different set points on that system. 6 months later, that system's just suboptimal at best, right? It's too complex, too many moving parts, too many fiddly knobs on it. So simplicity is actually the key design principle for a green building is persistence of performance, i.e. passive systems that perform no matter what, and simplicity, right? Passive system, take, triple glazing, right?
Yeah.
Not many moving parts on that. What do you have to do? Clean the glass, end. The performance is predictable.
Yeah. You don't have to feed it fuel, and it doesn't require electricity or gas, right? It's a pet rock. It's the absolute best. And it doesn't require therapy. And, when I think about buildings and the analogy between buildings and people, and you think about people that have had difficult times in their life, and as they get towards the end of their life, they've seen how countless therapists, right? And so they have all of this input going into their buildings, and it's changing, and they just go from one therapist to another, right? Well, buildings have the same issue. Like, they start out as a brand new baby, right? Mom and dad give birth to the building, and then they get passed over, and then the mechanical, electrical systems start to have problems. So they bring in a technician, right? And then there's a high probability that the next technician won't be the same as the first technician, or the third, or the 20th technician. Well, by the time you get to the 20th technician working on a building, that building is so screwed up, right? And that goes back to your commissioning colleagues, right? About taking the building back to where it was originally designed, because over its lifetime, it's been so modified in so many different ways that nothing functions the way it was intended.
And this is why there's resistance to verification and performance monitoring, because sometimes you don't want to know the answer to that.
Right, it's too scary.
Because then you got to do something. You're confronted with, this doesn't work. Now what do I do, right?
Right. Yeah, I get that. Herrero and VC finding the change agents. That's a cool concept, right? Because that's exactly what it is. These individuals, companies that are started because they see a way to do something better or differently, an opportunity to be rewarded financially. So they are really looking for the change agents, but everybody's looking for a return on that investment.
That's harder than it sounds, right? Because for a VC to be successful, let's say they place 10 investments, 9 of them are going to zero. They need one to work. But that one that works has to scale.
Yeah.
And scaling our business is really, really hard.
Yeah.
And that's the problem. That is a really tough nut to crack. It looks glamorous, it looks great, but it is really difficult. People don't understand how difficult that is.
Well, and she made the statement, everybody's looking for the story about coming from your garage to global domination.
I mean, there's been a few false dawns, right? I mean, there's a reason Microsoft and Google haven't entered the built environment and the construction market. You know why? Because it's a disaster, and they know there's no money in it.
Well, and there's been so many examples, the people that left Apple to start up different high-tech building systems and components, and then it's just like failure, like millions and millions of dollars that gets blown away.
So it's a game of incentives and disincentives, right? And money is a big incentive.
Yeah.
Disincentive. It's hard. It's really hard. Her job is really difficult.
It is, and she's working on behalf of obviously people who have an interest in returning on their investments. So there's people that have made money and are looking for someplace to put it, not lose it, but someplace to put it to have it grow, right? So that's an interesting world for sure. She used a term I'd not heard about before, which was interrogate the design. I mean, we did that when we were practicing, you get into design charrettes and you'd sit around on integrated design processes and you would look at the design. But interrogate is a good word.
Yeah, because it implies something being ruthlessly checked, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Nowhere to hide. Get that tool out. Highlight all the dark corners. People don't do well with that, by the way.
And especially if you've got to explain why you've done what you've done.
Yeah.
And especially, when everybody's at a table and there's relationships.
Yeah.
The architect with the client, the architect with the design professionals, the client with the land development, whatever, right? Whatever is going on, there's relationships. And an interrogation, it makes for some awkward moments, for sure.
Just you have this image of like this cartoon Gestapo agent.
Right?
Okay, everyone now, interrogate.
I love it. Well, it was good having her on, and I hope the idea of having property developers having residual value, and however you want to define the asset, that has to go somewhere else, to benefit somebody else. Like if you're not going to use, or you're not going to take the strategy to do the best that you possibly can, but you're still going to have something left over, that has to go to help some other cause, some other social part of the world. I think that's brilliant. I love that idea, and it would be interesting to see something like that become public. It would be, like this is what's going on in the world of architecture, and this is how
some of that in the UK. There's a thing called a Section 106 when you get a planning consent, like a building permit, and a proportion of that project has to either produce social housing or build a playground or do some social public good. So it becomes a tax on developers ultimately, right? And obviously it's resisted and negotiated down to the limits.
Right.
It still happens.
Yeah.
So, there are ways to go with it, but the days of just there's a bit of land I'm building an office block, those are over actually. Them days are gone.
Do you think in the world of unions and their role in construction, and I just see there's been so much pushback by unions and construction culture, not isolating unions as a statement here, but just the culture of construction, particularly commercial buildings, institutional, industrial buildings, is so ingrained. And then you two were talking about the role of return on investment in venture capitalism, and will that be able to break down? Will the returns break down the culture? And I asked the question: do you think that'll happen in our lifetime?
I do believe it will, but I can tell you, North America will be the last place because of the strength of unions.
Right.
So people think Canada, America, or NAFTA is an open market. It is not. It is a walled garden, and consequently, I would say, and I'm not saying this because I'm a Brit and a Canadian, Europe and the UK are one generation ahead in their building, design and practice. Mostly driven by the fact that energy costs a lot more over there. Everything just costs a lot more over there, right? So it drives design.
Yeah.
And there's no unions there. There are, but they got no power. So unions will resist till the day they die, right? So any technology innovation that comes on that takes a job away from a union member, there's a court case coming there, right? So if you're an investor, you just go, I'm just going to ignore that bit and we're going to go over here, Asia, Europe, somewhere else, right? That's how it's going to go down. So I believe you will see that change, but it will not be coming out of North America
Yeah.
at all.
Well, yeah, the money's going to go where there's less resistance to returns. And if there's huge resistance, why would you put your money there, right?
Why fight the union when you can go somewhere else and not have that? Money goes to where it's treated best. That it's like water. It's the path of least resistance.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
That is it and all about it. And the world is now tending towards more barriers, trade barriers, more regulation. So that's only going to get worse. So the only thing that will drive change in North America is absolutely a financial bottom line, which trumps everything. But, when I worked in New York, there was a job I was working on, and someone tried to bring in pre-wired air handling units, and the units were delivered, all the control wiring pre-wired, and one night the union guys went in and cut all the wires and said, no, that's our job. We're going to rewire it. You've got powers to do it.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Right.
So, and there was nothing you could say about it or do about it. And there was on that same job, there was another court case where they were trying to put in plastic PVC rainwater down pipes. And the union took them to court and said, no, they have to be cast because that's taking tradesmen's work away. And they won the court case. So what can you do? Can't fight that.
Yeah.
You just go, okay, you do you, and we're going to go over here with that money.
Yeah.
There's no point fighting Tony Soprano. You're not going to win that.
Yeah. Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see, and I think I'll probably be long gone before we see any changes of consequence here in North America when it comes to the construction industry. I think
Victoria will 100% see it, and it will be driven by social pressure as well. This is a phenomenon in the UK. Like some buildings that comply with code and should be given a building permit are not because the mob doesn't want it.
Well, it's interesting to bring that up because you knew about Charlie Munger, right? Yeah. Warren Buffett's partner who passed away. And of course, he had funded or provided some money for a dormitory, I guess. I don't remember what university it was. But the design of the building attracted so much pressure from within the community that they scrapped it. Yeah. Even though Charlie said, "Well, I'll fund it. We'll make available residences for students because it's needed," but the society said, "Yeah, we need it, but not that bad."
Yeah. So that social pressure is actually a very underestimated force. Mm. People don't take it into account, and sometimes it comes up quick and bites you. As a developer, if you're not thinking about that, you can really get caught out if you're not careful. Yeah. So the game gets more complicated and more difficult by the year. There's what you said for being on the back end of your career sometimes, right? You're not in the fight sometimes. It's exhausting having these fights, right?
Oh, it is. It is so exhausting.
Anyway, on that note, I shall let you get back to the good life. And,
all right, you too.
See you on the next one.
All right, Adam. Always a pleasure, man. Cheers.
See you, man. Bye.
You've been listening to the Edifice Complex podcast with Adam Muggleton and Robert Bean. To access show notes for this episode, visit edificecomplexpodcast.com. If you have enjoyed this podcast, please leave us a review on iTunes. See you next time.